So we finally have a King week and I'm going to be reviewing these today, so come and join me and find out which one was my favourite. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name is Mel and I like to review books. So today's video is going to be another episode of K is May, where essentially I review all of the books that I read in the last week, which correspond with the reading prompt that I've set for this month. So the reading prompt I've set this month is that I can only read books where the author's forename or the surname begins with a K. And the reason I've done that is I wanted to read some Stephen King, and also I've got loads of really good authors on my shelf where K seems to be the most popular letter in either the forename or the surname. So I have a video from last week where I've reviewed the first weeks of books, so I'll put a link to the playlist for these videos at the end of this video if you want to catch up on those. So at the end of last week I had left you where I had just started reading The Regulators by Stephen King. So technically this one was published under his pseudonym Richard Bachman, but it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day it's still Stephen King that wrote in it, so I'm still going to say that K is the author for this book. So this was published in 1996, and what I had realised when I first started reading it, that there's actually another book that complements this book. So there's also a book called Desperation that Stephen King wrote, and this was also published in 1996. And basically these come as a pair. So you can read one without the other, you don't necessarily need to read them both, but they complement each other. So I was sort of interested last week when I started this one. It mentioned the town Desperation, and I thought, oh, that's the name of the other Stephen King book. This must be the pair of books which essentially you have to read together. So I'd asked the internet, which one should I read first? And of course it said Desperation because I was already 100 pages into The Regulators. So I thought, well, I'm going to carry on with The Regulators and just see how that goes, and then I'll read Desperation immediately after, and then I'd be able to tell you, you know, if you can read them out of order. And to be honest, I don't think it really makes that much difference which order you read them in. Yeah, it's slightly easier to understand the underlying thing that's sort of going on throughout these books, possibly if you read Desperation first. But if you just read The Regulators and you never read Desperation, you could still understand the story in The Regulators, to be honest. So I'll just start with my review of The Regulators first. So I did say last week that I had found this a little bit confusing when I started it, because I do feel that there's a lot of characters in this book because it's set on a street. And it opens on a street where we're basically introduced to all of the neighbours in this street. And it feels like there's about 12 of them, possibly more. And then there's like people sort of walking down the street who don't actually live on the street as well, or people who work on the street. And within the first few pages, this was a little bit overwhelming because it was like, oh, I can't really remember who is who. And it's like you're trying to remember, somebody stood outside of that house, someone stood near the shop, that person was stood near a dog, and it was really confusing. Now there is a nice little map like in the front of the book. Let's see if I can just get that up to show you. See, so we've got this little map in the front of the book, which is kind of like a rough idea of where everybody lives on the street. But there's a couple of things like that in this book, like postcards as well as like this sort of handwritten map. And I've got to be honest, like the text is a little bit hard to read. I don't think it's clear enough because it's sort of done like it's somebody's handwriting. And I don't think that the way that they've printed it makes it that easy to read. So I've got to be honest, like the map in here wasn't overly helpful for me. So yeah, that was a little bit confusing. This is definitely the horror genre, and this starts off really violently and it continues in a really, really violent vein. So if you're not really into like blood and guts horror, this one might not be for you. I think this is one of the most violent Stephen King books that I've ever read, to be honest. However, I really enjoyed it. As I said, I found it quite difficult at the start, trying to understand, okay, who is who. But he also kills off quite a lot of people. So, you know, it does narrow the pool of people down that you have to try and remember. So that makes it a little bit easier, I guess. And then I would also say, as I said, there's things like little postcards and letters in here. And some of them are just unreadable. So I think that they've been put into the story to, you know, sort of help guide you along as to what's sort of happening. or what one character knows that another character doesn't know. And it's not always that helpful, but I think that's probably more down to the choice of printing, like how they've printed it. But there's other kind of mixed media in here with other letters which are, instead of like using what looks like handwriting, they've actually just used normal type in them. And those ones are really interesting and much easier to read. So, as I say, this is set in a street of people, and essentially this event happens to this street of people, and this street is kind of like in isolation to the town that they're in. And you know, it's like a fever dream almost, like, as like I say, like, you know, this is not something that you would ever kind of like. It starts off really violently, we think, oh, okay, this could actually happen, but then where it goes is kind of like into the fantasy realm, I would say. And you kind of have to suspend a lot of your disbelief, you know, to actually carry on with this story. But I did really kind of like it. I think this sort of goes back to more of the idea of what happens if you've got a curse, in a way, like what can come of that curse. So yeah, I actually really enjoyed this one. I said there was a couple of things, I'm not gonna lie, there's a couple of things that I might have done differently, I with printing and stuff. And let's say it's quite a smack in the face when you open the book and you suddenly got like 12 characters and like I don't know who you are. But generally on the whole, I thought this was really, really good. And I think that as far as the Bachman books go, I still really rate Thinner up there, I think, as my favourite, but this is definitely close to that. I much preferred this to kind of like The Running Man or The Long Walk and Roadworks and Rage. So yeah, I'd probably say this is my second favourite of the Richard Bachman books. I thought that the story was, while it was quite complicated in the end, like where it was going, I just thought it was really good. It was quite, you know, raw, and like it felt like proper horror. I gotta be honest, with some of the Stephen King books I read, I don't actually really think they're horror. I don't think they really fall into the horror genre, even though he's sort of typecast as this horror author. But this one definitely is. So then I went on straight away to read Desperation to try and understand how this one is actually linked to The Regulators. And I think, really, again, this one is definitely in the horror genre, and this one is also extremely violent. I really enjoyed this one. Like, I got through the first 10 pages and I was like, we are definitely onto a winner with this book. Like, it just hooked me in. It was, you know, it was really gripping. And this basically utilises more or less the same cast of characters that are in this one. But the difference is with this one is you're introduced to the characters a bit more slowly. They're not all just all stood in the street together when the event happens, like in this one. Whereas in, you know, this one, it's kind of like, oh, you meet 3 of them and then you meet 2 of them, and that makes it much easier for you to kind of remember who they are and what their role is, and everything like that. And even though this is utilising the same cast of characters, more or less, there are a couple of differences between the 2 books. It's not like this event happened to these characters and then this event happened to these same characters. It's not like that at all. Like, you might have it so that the character is a child in the one book and then an adult in the other book, or they might be in one profession in one book or one profession in the other book, or in the one book they might die and then in the other book they don't. So it's not like this is a follow-on story to this one. I just think that people say to read this one first because this is set in the town of Desperation where there's a mine, and basically something is uncovered in that mine, and out of that is where we get the story that then happens in here. But likewise for this, what's happening in this story is because of what happened in the mine in Desperation, more or less. So it's still, the story is still centered around the mine, if you like, but it's not exactly the same story. It's very, very, very similar. And it's almost like, if we think of the mine as a prompt, and it's like, okay, let's have an old mine that can have like a curse that's like buried deep within it. What kind of different stories could we do with it? And it's almost like we have used the characters in one way in this book, and then in another way in this book. And as I say, you can't read it like, say you've got John in one book, you can't say John went through this and then in the other book he went through this, and it's just simply not possible, as I said, because some of the characters are like a child in one book, an adult in the other book, and then maybe if you looked at Desperation first, they'd have died in the first book, so they could never have been in the second book, but they were in the second book. So one doesn't necessarily, you don't have to read one to have read the other, but I think that there's more backstory about the mine in this book, which might make things a little bit easier. However, I still feel like it's explained in this one, and I also feel like the way the curse is spoken about in these two books, like they're still a little bit different in each book. So yeah, definitely I would read both, and I'm glad that I read them back to back as well, because I think that was easier for me to then sit down with a piece of paper and go, okay, in this book, there was this character and they had this role in the book and this job title, and then in this book, this is like the same character, but this is the role they had in this book, you know? And it was just easier for me to sort of match the two books together and really see like how the characters either were the same or different. And then, you know, interestingly, there are some characters that more or less play the same role in both books. So that's interesting. So I think this is more like, as I said, maybe last week, it's kind of like a parallel universe. It's kind of like, you know, if we had John in this universe and, you know, we had this mine with this curse in it, what might happen? But if we had John in this other universe with this mine and a curse in it, what might happen? And that's kind of like how these have been written, I would guess. I think on the whole that I preferred this one. I would definitely give this one a 5-star. I thought this was just like absolutely brilliant. And I really got into it from the moment that I opened the first page. And this book is just over 700 pages long. And I flew through it in 4 days because I just wanted to keep reading this book. I really enjoyed this book. I even thought when I was about 50 pages in, will this knock Christine off the top spot for favourite book? That is how much I enjoyed this book. I was really, really into this one. So I still think that Christine is my favourite, but this one is probably at the moment in the top 5 of all the Stephen King books that I've read so far. And at this point, I think I've read 36. So that's really saying something. Like, this was a really, really enjoyable read, really gripped me, and I would definitely read this one again. And in a way, I'm glad I read this one second, because I'd much rather have had like a chaser that was a 5-star than set out with a 5-star and then finished off with one that maybe wasn't quite a 5-star. So yeah, like I really recommend this. If you're a Stephen King fan and you haven't read this one, you need to get on it. And yeah, it might help if you read this one before The Regulators. But as I say, it's not totally necessary to read The Regulators. This one, again, I still really enjoyed this one. There were just aspects of it that I think I might have done a little bit better, like the whole, you know, as I said, a bit confusing at the start with all the characters and how some of the media was presented. One thing I'd also say between these two books, what is a small detail in this book is actually a much bigger detail in this book as well, which I kind of like found interesting. So generally on the whole, I was still interested in this book. I really enjoyed the story. It's definitely one of the top Bachman books I think that I've read. So I think I'm going to rate this one a 4.25 star. I've kind of mentioned why it didn't quite meet the 5-star potential. But honestly, these two books together were a really, really enjoyable read. So I do recommend that you read both of them and you read them like, you know, one after the other. As I said, I can see why people would say to read this one first, but actually personally I'm glad I read this one second because it was nice to finish with the 5-star. But both thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyable books. So I'm really happy that I had a bit of a Stephen King week, if I'm honest, because I feel that I have got through a lot. I've managed to get 2 more off my TBR on my Stephen King shelving as well. And I gotta be honest, like, I've not heard many people talk about Desperation, but yeah, it's up there, I think, as one of my favourite ones. So it's just been sitting there quiet and unassuming on my shelf, and actually it was an absolute banger. So believe it or not, despite the, the one of those, the Desperation book was just over 700 pages, and The Regulators was just over 400 pages. I did have a little bit of capacity to do a bit more reading in the last week. I seemed to get loads of time last week to read, so now I've had that last week, probably this week I won't. But yeah, I did try to pick up some more books to read. Now, I bought this book not that long ago, Victoria Keeland, My Men. Now, this was published in 2021, but I have only become aware of this in the last 2 months. Like, this was a new purchase just before this month, to be honest. And whilst I wasn't really looking to acquire any more books at the moment, I picked this up because this is a fictional story about the real-life serial killer Belle Gunness, also known as Brunhild or Belle Sorensen. She's a few names, and basically this was a Norwegian woman at the beginning of the 20th century who emigrated from Norway to America and then basically carried out a killing spree. And I became aware of her because last year I had listened to the audiobook Triflers Need Not Apply by Camilla Bruce. And I have to admit, this was probably one of my favourite audiobooks that I listened to last year. And she also wrote a fictional tale about the same woman, Belle Gunness. Hers was a little bit longer than this one, but I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and I thought Belle was a very, very, very interesting character, sort of based on that book. So I was really pleased to have found that, because again, I'd never seen anybody speaking about that, and I just managed to get it on an offer on Audible and thought, oh, I'll give that a go, and then I was absolutely hooked, you know. But that was also published in 2021. So I can only imagine that both of these authors kind of had an idea at the same time to write about this woman, but in the, the fictional, because they both got released like probably months apart from each other. So I was definitely interested to pick this up because I wanted to see if it, was as fun as Triflers Need Not Apply. Unfortunately, I am not getting on with this book. It's a 200-page book, and I read 50 pages, and I'm really not invested in it in the same way that I was in the other one. It seems to me in this one that our character is more like in a stream of consciousness rather than, us having a cast of characters that are like really talking to each other. But I don't know if it's the way it's translated. I don't know if this is how the author has actually written this book. But I just feel like every couple of lines, we have a new metaphor for how the sunshine is stuck to the inside of her eyelids or is on her face in some way. And they're just really cheesy, and, it's really not me at all, if I'm honest. So I'm really not enjoying this, but this is not a very long book, so I think that I'm going to try and persist with this for a little while longer, rather than do a DNF, because maybe there is more to this book. I've got through like what I would class as section 1, which is what happened to her in Norway before she emigrated. I haven't actually seen how the writer has written what's happened after the emigration has happened. So maybe things will pick up and improve them, but I've got to be honest, this is not doing very well with me right now. So check back in with me next week to see how I feel about this one and where this is going. But yeah, this is a bit of a disappointment so far. And because I didn't want to end up in a reading slump, because that is really how I felt that book was going with me the other day, I decided to pick up another book to start reading instead. So I started picking up one that I've had my eye on for a while, which is The Names by Florence Knapp. So this was published last year in 2025. So I've got the hardback because I managed to get an edition from Goldsboro, which is why I've got these pretty edges. And Florence Knapp has actually signed this copy. But I thought that the premise of this sounded really, really good. Now, for anybody who's interested in this book, I have noticed now that the paperback has just come out, and it does seem to be available to buy at Sainsbury's in the book aisle for a fairly good price. So just let you know if you're looking to purchase this. What I would say is I don't feel so far that the synopsis of this book really matches what I am reading in this book. However, I am still really enjoying this book. I think it's really well written. It's really sucked me in. I'm really getting into the story. And I'm, really invested to see where it goes. So I'm not going to say much more about the synopsis in comparison to the story. I'll do that when I actually review this book next week. But I just think that is sort of worth mentioning, and it'd be interesting if any of you have actually read this book and if you felt that actually the synopsis didn't really match the contents of the book, because I'm only a third of the way through this at the moment. This is about 340 pages and I think I'm about 120, so yeah, just over a third of the way through. But I am really, really enjoying this writing. This is Florence Knapp's debut novel, I believe, as well. So, this is a bit of a cracker. Like, it's done really, really well. I mean, as I've seen loads of really, really good commentary on this, and it's been on loads of, best of lists for 2025. So I've got to be honest, I had high hopes for this one. So I'm glad that I finally managed to start reading this one. So yeah, I won't do a full review of that right now, as I said, because I'm only about a third of the way through, but you can sort of see from the two that I've just shown you there what might be coming up for reviews when we do this again next Friday. And obviously I hope I'll have time to read some more out of the pile. So I've got a pile of a few authors here that I might want to get into. It's like Barbara Kingsolver, Kate Quinn, Carissa Chen, Kazu Ishiguro, and there's a couple of authors beginning with K that I haven't actually put in this pile that are sort of scattered around my bookshelves that I could technically pick up as well. So yeah, let me know in the comments down below if you've read Desperation and The Regulators, and if you felt like which order you read them in and how you found them. And if you've read the names, did you feel like the synopsis did really match the contents of the book, but you still enjoyed it anyway? Because that's how I kind of feel I'm going with it. And has anybody read My Men by Victoria Keeland, and what did you think of that? Because it might be, I've got to be honest, it might be that I'm just trying to compare this to Triflers Need Not Apply, which is been written in a completely different style, I think, to this one, and maybe I just thought I was getting more of the same with this one, and I'm not. So yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I look forward to seeing you next Friday for some more reviews. Thanks for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. Bye!